All right, hello and welcome to our first session. This session is going to be about machine learning and data science. The idea is we want to have a forum to discuss modern machine learning and data science techniques as they apply to open research questions in aerosol science. So I'm going to be one of your moderators. The other one, so I'm Tessum from the University of Illinois. We also have Silva in the back there, who will be our online advocate. And so we're going to have a number of talks. So the first two are going to be about kind of emulating different aerosol related things using machine learning. Then we'll have a couple more about using machine learning for more kind of basic science types of things, quantum chemical modeling and molecules. Then we'll have one about kind of machine learning and large scale modeling of the Earth system. And then we'll have a final one about kind of looking towards the future, looking at stakeholder development and model development. All right, so our first speaker is going to be Andrew Geiss. He's a data science at Pacific Northwestern National Laboratory. He's a data scientist there in the Atmospheric Science and Global Change Division. He received his PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Washington in 2020. He focuses on applications of machine learning and data science to various research areas in the atmospheric sciences, including climate modeling, satellite, remote sensing, radar meteorology, and boundary layer dynamics. So everybody welcome Andrew Geiss.
All right, so I'm Andrew Geiss. I'm a data scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. This is some work I've been doing as part of the EAGLES project, which was that acronym kind of down at the bottom of the slide there, trying to develop a new machine learning-based parameterization for aerosol optical properties for use in E3SM, which is the Department of Energy's climate model. So yeah, aerosols have a pretty substantial impact on the Earth's radiative budget. Part of that is through their interaction with clouds, and part of it is their direct effect, their direct interaction with radiation. But calculating the optical properties of aerosol populations is computationally expensive, or at least it's too computationally expensive to do on the fly in a climate simulation. So it gets parameterized. So yeah, here we're developing machine learning-based parameterization to replace the parameterization that is currently being used in E3SM. And as part of this project, we've used a neural architecture search strategy that's kind of unique. So part of this talk will be about that. So this slide kind of diagrams where this parameterization sits within the model. Yeah, we're working with E3SM. This diagram is just a diagram showing an atmosphere grid. This is not actually E3SM's grid. But E3SM's atmosphere model uses the middle aerosol module to represent aerosol populations, and it uses RTMG as its radiation code. MAN works by, it represents a number of different aerosol species that are grouped into, in this case, 4 different modes, where each mode has an assumed log normal size distribution. Basically, every time the radiation code gets called, it needs to know information about the optical properties of those the aerosol populations in each grid cell in the model. And this parameterization basically sits between MAM and the radiation code. So whenever the radiation code is called, this parameterization takes information about the aerosol populations currently represented by MAM and outputs estimates of the bulk optical properties of those populations that can then be used by the radiation code. This slide explains why this is something that needs to be parameterized. Many atmospheric aerosols scatter in the mu regime, which is the scattering regime where particle size is within a couple orders of magnitude of the wavelength of light it's interacting with. And then the mu regime optical properties of a particle can vary pretty wildly as a function of the particle size. So over on the right is a plot that's an example of this. It compares the size parameter of a particle, which is the ratio of a particle radius to wavelength, to a particle's extinction efficiency. And yeah, you can see the amount of variability there. To find an individual particle's optical properties, assuming that it's a sphere, you would use a ME code. And Me code is relatively slow. Finding solutions to this problem involve truncating an infinite series, and you potentially need to compute tens or hundreds of terms to get an accurate solution. And then to solve this problem for an aerosol population, you have to do an integration over the particle size distribution, running me code at every different size. So that potentially requires hundreds of calls to a me code. And then if you're going to do this online in the model, you need to do this for each aerosol mode and wavelength of light in each grid cell. So that adds up pretty quickly. So this is a diagram kind of explaining how this parameterization works. The approach that's currently used is essentially just a large lookup table. The idea is you can pre-compute bulk optical properties of a bunch of different plausible aerosol populations, and then look up their properties at runtime in this lookup table and just do interpolation within that lookup table. It's a little more complicated than that. They use the parameterization uses Chebyshev interpolation along one of the lookup table's dimensions, but it's essentially just a lookup table. So our idea is to use kind of a similar approach, but replace this lookup table with a neural network. But we can still take this approach of using me code to pre-compute the optical properties of a bunch of plausible aerosol populations ahead of time and use that as training data for the neural network that then gets used instead of the existing parameterization. And then down at the bottom, I've listed the inputs to the parameterization and the outputs. So there are 5 inputs to the existing parameterization. This means that if you're going to use a lookup table-based approach, basically if you want to increase the resolution of the lookup table, the size of the lookup table grows really quickly because it's a 5-dimensional table. So our approach is to try to replace this parameterization with a neural network. We'll use me code to generate our training data set. And we decided to use a neural architecture search to try to find a neural network that provides a good balance between the network size and the network accuracy. And this is a good problem to do this sort of thing on because we can generate basically as much training data as we want. Ideally, we would like a neural network that is very lightweight because it's going to get called a lot when the climate model is run. And I'm working with relatively small neural networks that can be trained pretty quickly on CPU. So we did this random search where we randomly generate neural networks and train them. And then we're just going to select the one that performs the best. But we randomize things like number of layers, layer sizes, and transfer functions. But more interestingly, based on this paper that's cited down the bottom of this slide, we decided to randomize the network graphs as well. So the ways that the layers are connected. And these diagrams show a couple of examples where each of those dots is a layer in a neural network. So this slide is looking at the performance of a bunch of these neural networks. So yeah, basically in these 2 scatter plots I'm showing, each dot represents a randomly constructed neural network. The vertical axis represents the model's error on a validation data set we generated, and the horizontal axis represents the number of parameters in the model. So ideally, we would like to find a neural network that sits somewhere around kind of the elbow of that point cloud that provides a good balance between accuracy and model complexity. So yeah, all the parts in this slide represent randomly constructed neural networks. The solid lines are a comparison to conventional, like serially connected neural networks. And kind of an interesting result here is that the randomly constructed ones that include lots of skip connections actually tend to perform better than the serially connected ones. So this makes me think that including skip connections is actually pretty important for this problem, or at least can provide performance benefits. Okay, so yeah, this slide is a evaluation of the parameterizations on a testing data set. Each of these panels here shows a different optical property, and these are essentially scatter plots. They're actually joint histograms because I had a lot of points. But yeah, basically each of the shading there represents represents points in a testing data set. The horizontal axis is the output using me code, so we're taking that to be ground truth, and the vertical axis is the output from the parameterization. So the gray shading here is showing the outputs from the parameterization that's currently used. And the red contour is a line that surrounds all of the points output by the neural network. So these neural networks are actually able to like very accurately fit this data, and they essentially all of their outputs lie on the one-to-one curve here. And I've also got a table down at the bottom that is showing the average or averaged error over the this test set, where there's a row for the randomly constructed neural networks, the serially connected ones that are just like conventional neural networks, and the gammons vary down at the bottom is the existing parameterization. The parameters column is just showing the number of parameters used by the parameterization. So the neural networks are about an order of magnitude smaller than that lookup table, and they provide a couple of orders of magnitude increase in accuracy. Yeah, so what I've presented so far is actually finished work. We've published a paper on that. But this project has continued, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've done since then. So initially, we set out just to replace the parameterization with something that does essentially the same thing, and now we've actually added some new capabilities. First of all, the existing parameterization assumes that within aerosol modes, you just do volume-weighted mixing of the refractive indices of different aerosol species, which isn't all that realistic. And in particular, we wanted to include the capability of representing a sulfate-coated black carbon. So to do this, we can still use MeCode that is capable of representing a core shell model where you have concentric spheres that have different refractive indices. This slide is an example of the difference that mixing assumptions make on the optical properties of an individual particle. So these three curves are showing extinction efficiency of a particle versus the particle size in the horizontal. And these are for a combination of black carbon and sulfates. One line represents what you get. So the black line is what you get if you assume two separate sets of homogeneous spheres. So one set for black carbon, one set for sulfate, and you average their extinction efficiencies. The blue curve represents what you get if you assume volume mixing of their refractive indices and treat the particle as a homogeneous sphere. And then the red line is what you get using a core shell model. So yeah, basically the main point is these are very different curves. So this mixing assumptions make a big difference in optical properties. The other big change that I made is the initial version of this model that I trained was specific to use with MAM4 and the specific wavelength bands used by RTMG. And I thought it would be nice to have a generalizable model that can solve this general problem of estimating the optical properties of a log normal size distribution of any aerosol for any wavelength. So I have several equations on here that I'm not going to go into much detail about. But basically, I changed the problem so that I'm now trying to estimate the value shown up at the top. That's a specific extinction, which is essentially like mass averaged extinction over a size distribution. So I've changed the problem, so I'm now estimating that. And in those integrals at the top, I can do a change of variables to express everything in terms of particle size parameter and express the geometric mean of the log normal size distribution as essentially a size parameter. And by doing this, I reduce the dimensionality of the input space of the neural network by one dimension and know the exact bounds of integration that I need that will cover the mu regime. And basically, in short, this makes it so I can train a single neural network that can represent any log normal size distribution at any wavelength of light. So I now only need to train a single neural network to represent both the shortwave and long wave. So we have So I did I trained neural networks using this sort of reformulation of the problem, both for homogeneous spheres and for the core shell model. And these plots are similar scatter plots to the ones shown earlier. Each of these dots represents a different neural network. The black dots represent randomly constructed neural networks, and the red dots represent conventional serially connected ones. And yeah, so on the left, I'm showing the case for homogeneous spheres. On the right, I'm showing the core shell model. In both cases, we're able to get, negligibly small errors. So both of these are reasonably good replacements for the existing parameterization. We still saw a big increase in performance in the homogeneous sphere case when using randomly constructed neural networks, but there was only a very small increase in the core shell case, which is sort of an interesting result. Yeah, so this is my summary slide. This is still ongoing work. So currently we're still working on integration of this parameterization into E3SM. That has turned out to be kind of a hard problem because the software package we're using to convert between these Python-based neural networks and the Fortran-based model does not support these kind of unusual network architectures. So we're currently working on finding a way to use those randomly wired architectures in E3SM. E3SM version 4 will be written in C++, and it will be a lot easier to do this sort of thing. And I've just begun collaboration trying to come up with a way to represent non-spherical sulfate-coated black carbon particles. So yeah, I have a link here to the work that we've published on this already. And yeah, that'll take any questions.
Yeah, I just enjoy your talk. I just have one comment, is that when we do this machine learning, try to fit a physical-based model, it's like we're trying to fit F equal to MA. The accuracy is very important, right? If the R square get to 0.8 or 0.9, it's really not sufficiently, not kind of rigor in the physics. So I'm happy to see that you're, at least for the core shell, you get the accuracy to about 99.9% or something like that. Anyway, I just have a comment on that. I also sent you an email to share with some of our work using the machine learning to fit the non-spherical particle scattering. So which you touched upon a little bit later. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm just curious about, could you introduce a little bit of progress in integration approach, integration effort? And did you find that model integration to E3SM painful or interesting? Or I'm just curious about your perspective about that.
Well, so far it's been painful. I'm not actually doing the integration with the model. So Balwinder Singh, one of my co-authors there, is working on that problem. We're using, so we try using the Fortran Keras bridge to do this, which you might be familiar with. It's a useful piece of software, but it only supports very simple feed-forward neural networks. So yeah, Balwinder's been trying to add the capability to it to represent these like neural networks that include skip connections. That's been pretty difficult. So I think at this point, we're just going to choose one of those serially connected conventional neural networks and try using that so we can actually get some online modeling results. Because we still don't know how this interacts with the climate model.
Sorry. 5 years from now, if you have E3SM with machine learning in it, what does that look like? Is it like some sort of advanced version of the Fortran Keras bridge? Is everything written in C++? Or is it something else?
Well, so yeah, I mean, currently there's work on porting E3SM over to C++. Yeah, far enough into the future, everything will be, that whole model will be written in C++, and it'll be much easier to integrate ML models into the climate model, that will be nice, but that's a little ways down the road. Several years. I can't remember the planned planned date that that'll be finished, but.
All right, so our next speaker is Paula Harder. She is a PhD student at Fraunhofer ITWM. I don't know what that stands. What does it stand for? Something in.
That's German.
Okay, something in German. All right, industrial mathematics. There you go. So she's a final year PhD student working on deep learning for climate modeling together with that university, the University of Oxford and Quebec AI Institute. She's particularly interested in integrating physics constraints into neural networks and speeding up climate models with machine learning. She worked with aerosol models, wildfires, and super resolution. So everybody, welcome Paula.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks for having me here. Nice to meet you all. Works. Okay. Yeah, so I'm Paula. I first want to thank my co-authors, Duncan, to Phillips, Yanis, Dominic, and Nico from both this, my home institution, which is Fraunhofer Institute, a German-wide institution, and then University of Kaiserslautern, which is a small town in Germany, no one knows, and the University of Oxford, some people might know. And then the topic is physics-constrained learning of aerosol microphysics. And I actually think I gave one of my first talks on my PhDs 2 years ago on that conference when we just started the project. What I will go through a brief motivation, even though the aerosol background on aerosol motivation I keep kind of short because you all know much more about that than me. Then I talk about the data I'm using for my ML model, as well as how I construct my model. Go a bit more into detail on how we do the physics constraining. Then I talk about offline results, and then actually the last thing, which took most of the time of the whole project, is the integration back into a global climate model. Here we use ICANN, also the using this Fortune-Karras bridge. So the overall idea here is just that most global climate models don't include aerosols in sufficient details, mostly due to computational constraints. So here the idea is just to use ML as a speed up. We replace an aerosol model that already exists with a faster ML surrogate, which we call emulation. So it's quite similar to Andrew's approach. So the idea is, okay, we take the data, then train the ML model one time offline, and then we just have to apply it. The training is done, and at inference time, it's pretty fast. And we don't add any additional knowledge with ML, we just replace an existing model. And the model we are replacing is one that was developed, I think, from my Oxford colleagues a while ago. The Aerosol Microphysics model M7. The way it roughly works, it models different aerosol types, such as sulfates, organic black carbons, dust, sea salt, in different size bins. I think there are 4 different so-called modes that just represent different sizes of the aerosols. And then what this model does, the aerosols can move through the modes, through condensation or growth or coagulation. And then we just blindly want to replace this model that models the aerosol microphysics per grid box independently, going one time step ahead with an ML model. So the way we do it, we just produce input-output pairs. And here we first started the project off when it was ECMHAM. So now, at least in the UK or at the group I worked with, they like to use ICANN. I'm not sure. It's a model developed in from the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg in Germany, like icosahedral climate model. Not sure how much you're familiar with that. And HAM is just the aerosol component that is coupled to that, which has this M7 model in it. data we use. I ran a simulation for 5 years, and because it was with a time step, I think, of 10 minutes, and I subsampled from different locations, levels, times of the day, just to have a hopefully fairly complete description of the distribution of the aerosols. I started off with not with a smaller data set in terms of total number of data points, but with just 1 year of simulation and just 4 different days throughout a year. And that just didn't work well for the later on for the online case. So yeah, here the training, validation, and testing, we split into years to see if there's some sort of generalizability. So the first 4 years are used for training, and then for the offline evaluation, we have we split the last year into validation and testing, optimize our model on your network, and for testing, yeah, to get some offline scores. Oh, okay, this is each from different dates, but throughout the year, this is leftover. So they're from different days, but it's just some subsampling for the so as I said before, we're just replacing the existing model. So there's no spatial information, it's a box model. And we predict one fixed time step. Have about 35 input variables and then output variables. The input includes variables that describe the aerosol masses and numbers for different types, like the different model size and species. And they both input and output. And then we have input only variables that are atmospheric variables, such as temperature, pressure, relative humidity. And then also we have output only the water content of the aerosol. The data distribution was quite challenging. So the changes in the different variables can be very small compared to the actual variables, but we do want to get the changes right. So we don't learn just next mass, because what happened there is we just kind of predicted constant masses, but we want to train on the changes. And also the changes themselves have kind of an exponential distribution. And we played around with different normalization and transformation techniques. But so most naturally, you would use a logarithmic transformation, but then the overall scores back in the linear scale or in the original scale were worse. So we ended up again with just linear normalized data. So for training of the neural network, you always need to normalize. But yeah, we just did minus mean divided by standard deviation. So the architecture we ended up with was fairly simple. So it was, yeah, there's always, I think Andrew already mentioned that a bit, you always have the trade-off between complexity and then later like speed of your model. So you want to have it as small as possible. So this just had 2 hidden layers and nodes. We also tried some other ML approaches that are simpler, like random forests or linear regression, gradient boosting, but they all just didn't have a good offline performance. And yeah, we tried different patient functions and different setups. It all didn't change much, but the size didn't matter. So here again, you see that's what we're predicting. We're predicting a change in the aerosol masses and numbers, and some atmospheric variables and masses. So yeah, the physics constraining part. So that was just a problem I ran into. I started applying a neural network, but then I realized, okay, if I just naively apply a neural network, mass is not conserved, which is conserved in the original model. So thinking ahead, when I'm putting it back into the global climate model, finally, it's going to cause some issues. And also just sometimes there were positive masses, especially when predicting changes. And then you add up the change, it sometimes resulted in negative mass. So we had basically, we had a kind of a equality constraint. It's a bit more generally formulated here, but in our case, it was a very simple linear constraint you're going to see in a bit. And then the inequality constraint, which would just be that the predicted change plus the input is positive for masses and numbers. So there are two ways of doing it. I think the more straightforward way, which more people tried, is changing our loss function. So additional to the normal MSE we're using, adding a penalizing term, which can have some problems. But we don't have any guarantees basically, and we have to optimize lambda, which can be tricky. Then the other way is just to add a final constraint layer that by construction enforces, And so here, the soft constraint, you can have both here, the equality constraints, which you would just add, supposed to be 0, you penalize that. And for the inequality constraint, you put the RADO function. RADO is just, it's the identity function and just cuts off negative values. So here, penalizes negative values. Yeah. And then the hard constraint, we did two fairly simple ways here. There are other ways to enforce the constraints, but actually the simple ones work the best. The one we call is completion, which is partial set of the target variables, and then in the final step readjust the leftover set such that the constraints are met. And for an arbitrary age, that's maybe not possible, but for the case we're having here with linear constraints, that's pretty straightforward. And for inequality, we just correct. So this inequality constraint, we just set it to 0. So for example, if it can be, some cases it could just be a RADO function. If something is negative, we set it to 0. Also, there's a difference. You can, this hard constraints you can apply either offline, online. It has nothing to do with the offline or online of including kind model. It's just offline means we don't have it during training, but then during inference, we add this, for example, the correction layer. Or online, we already have it there during training. So our optimizing procedure, and we tested both, and actually there's not a big difference. So the constraints we had here for aerosols are one, the mass conservation. That just means per aerosol species, the variables, which are usually 4 variables from the different size modes, their changes have to add up to 0. And we can achieve that with the soft term or setting one as minus the sum of the others, and then by construction. And for constraints, it would be very easy if we would predict the mass directly, but here we can just add the input, which is the mass at the time step before, plus or number, plus the change. And that has to be positive, either with soft constraints, with a penalizing term, or with hard constraints. Let's go through the results briefly. Basically here, looking at mass conservation. So the overall baseline neural network, it does okay. It reaches a R² score of 7. And then it has some mass violation, which gets decreased a bit by adding the soft constraint. but still is there significantly. And then with the hard constraint, we get a guaranteed mass conservation. But if it's online or offline here, doesn't really matter. And for the positivity, it's similar here. The soft constraining doesn't work well. It decreases the performance in terms of L² score significantly. It still leaves a significant negative fraction. So the hard constraints ones are much better here. That's yeah. We have the original here, and then the x-axis on the y-axis, the predictions for different correction chains. They all look kind of similar. It's hard to tell. In terms of speed up, we can see that we mostly achieve a huge speed up on a GPU, not that much on a CPU. And then briefly, let me go through the integration at ICANN. We use what was mentioned earlier, the Fortran-Keras bridge. Therefore, we had to change from Python into Keras, but that's not that tricky. You can export your weights, and then they're just pre-implemented layers. And because we use a fairly simple architecture, that was pretty straightforward. That and ICANN. We had some stability issues that mostly happen when encountering out of sample. Out of distribution samples, but with bigger layers and the constraining, we achieved it. With bigger neural networks, we achieved a stable run. That's some offline results for AOD and absorption coefficient and angstrom component. And yeah, to sum up, because I'm just left. Can use neural networks for that. We can incorporate physics with hard constraints when they're simple on GPU. And yeah, we can achieve accurate and stable results with the help of constraints, but our online speedup was very small because of the Fortran-Keras bridge, just supports batch size of 1. And future work is mainly speeding up the neural network. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very impressive. The R² is only, of course, one measure of reliability of your neural network. There seem to be some large biases that way off the line. I couldn't tell if it was even a log plot. I mean, did you try other criteria for your reliability, like the fraction of points that are unacceptably bad or anything like that? There seem to be quite a few.
We looked at other scores apart from the R² score, like mean bias, for example, but that seemed kind of low. I am not sure if I understood. You meant in the plots where it was showing
the correlation plots, yeah.
Yeah. So mostly, so sometimes when it gets close to 0, I think it can look a bit odd. But yeah, we mostly tried mean average error, mean squared error, mean bias, negative values, but yeah, maybe it would be worth considering other scores. You mean looking at how like extreme discrepancies between prediction and truth? So, okay.
Could you give us an idea of the mean bias?
It was a bit tricky because I normalized the values because we have different scales for each aerosol variable. And then it was just in the orders of 10 to the -3 or 4 if I normalize the values. But it's probably more interesting to have it per variable, and I don't know that by heart.
Hi, Davin Himsey from University of Colorado. Thanks for the presentation. It's really nice to see and very impressive that, maybe some of the statistics aside, that it's just even stable in an online integration. But I was curious though, the mass conservation constraint that you showed was like a sum of yi equals 0, where I was your species index. So you're conserving the changes in mass as you're adding across different species like OC versus BC and dust.
No, just per species. So the sum was just over the different variables of the same species. So for example, for dust, I have 4 variables for each size. And what the dust particles do, they can change sizes, but the overall dust mass stays the same in that microphysical model. Later, there are other models that have sources and sinks, but so it's per species, the conservation.
Thanks.
I had a question about the way you did mass conservation. It looks like you essentially dumped the extra mass into one particular aerosol mode, which follows like Tom Buechler's nice work for energy conservation as well. How do you decide which where to dump that mass, right? Which one gets left out and used for mass conservation, and so on? Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great question. So I think there's 4 different ways I consider it. So one is just randomized, and in each pass it's a random variable. Second is randomized but fixed, like you just choose one and keep that. Then use the worst performing one, just run the baseline and then choose a variable that does the worst. And then the 4th one, you can actually choose it as well, so the inequality constraints are met at the same time, but then you have to search, you check for, 4 different indices you could choose, and for each you could check, if I choose that, would that result in a negative prediction? And that's actually, I think, the best, but it's the most complicated. In terms of scores, offline, there were no big differences for my case, but yeah.
All right, our next speaker is, be tolerant of this. I'm guessing Jakub Kubecka. Is that more maybe you'll let me know how to say it properly. He's been actively engaged in the field of atmospheric computational chemistry for more than a decade. His research primarily focuses on molecular clusters, investigating their formation in the atmosphere and their impact on the generation of new particles. Lately, Jakub?
Yep.
Jakub, okay, has ventured into the realm of machine learning methods, employing it as an alternative to computationally demanding quantum chemistry calculations in his scientific endeavors. Welcome, Jakub.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jakub, and I will show you a different type of machine learning, what we use to enhance quantum chemistry calculations on molecular clusters. I come from Denmark, and there we focus on new particle formation, how aerosol particles are formed in the atmosphere. So basically it means that we watch how single molecules come together, collide, and form a molecular cluster. If that cluster is stable enough and does not evaporate apart, it can grow further into a particle such as aerosol or cloud condensation nuclei. So we studied the beginning of this process of the molecular cluster formation and so on. For that, we used so-called atmospheric cluster dynamics code. First, we pick our system we are interested in. It is some kind of molecule which collides for a dimer, trimer. But typically in the atmosphere, you don't have that strong type of interaction for a single molecule. And even water, for instance, itself would form unstable clusters and just wouldn't grow further. So you need some stronger type of interactions. And typically this is between some acid and base where hydrogen proton transfer can occur. And therefore we need to model 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, or multidimensional schemes of these molecular clusters, depending how many components we are interested in. And those are the monomers which can then collide and eventually further grow into particles. So this is what we put to AC/DC. And this basically solves all the equations for the cluster evolution. And this can be one of the results. How many particles are formed in a volume per second when we study, for instance, sulfuric acid, ammonia in a chamber or in the atmosphere? Okay, so what do we need to know for that? We need to know how often the particles collide. For that, this forward reaction, it is enough to use kinetic gas theory in the first approximation. And to go back, we need to know how fast the molecules evaporate. And for that, we use quantum chemistry calculations because there is too little experimental data for this. So quantum chemistry calculations, yeah. Well, and here is some equation. We put it in. And what does it mean? What we have to actually calculate when it comes to molecular cluster like this one? We have to first, we have long time worked on it. We have prepared some configurational sampling. It means that we have to basically describe the whole potential energy surface of the molecular cluster, all the various configuration and their energy assigned. Those are, for instance, different molecular clusters. We don't care about excited states, but somebody could care about excited state. What we care about is that this is quantum chemistry. So you cannot have some kind of energy, you need to have a specific kind of energy. So you get the various vibrational and rotational energy states. And basically this energy minima is what gives us basically the configuration that we search for. Typically, we search first for the energies, but at low temperature, you can find that the low energies are occupied, but when you go to atmosphere, it is not the energy, but it's the average over energy states, and you must find all the minima basically. So yeah, that's this. What is this energy? For that, we of course solve Schrödinger equation. There is many methods. Please don't get scared, but there is many methods like this, what we quantum chemistry guys use. Often it looks like they have random numbers and letters, but that's not important. What is important for you to now understand that we are trying to find methods that suit for our system, like that have the least mean absolute error when it comes to the energy and take also the least computational time. So you can have in quantum chemistry, the chemical accuracy is approximately 1 kcal per mole. This is what we are trying to reach. So you need this kind of methods, very high, but computationally demanding. So it means that I need 30 hours, for instance, to calculate one energy in a good accuracy. One energy, it means 1 point on this potential energy surface. And it means that this is 1 point, but I need the whole potential energy surface. I have a molecular cluster that can have different sizes, different number of molecules, and I can have also different cluster types. That is so many calculations that we just cannot do using quantum chemistry, and we need a machine learning. So this is how we use machine learning. First, we prepare our molecules, which we just write down in some machine-readable format. This is what we call molecular representation. It's just somehow not only the XYZ coordinates, but somehow restructured. We assign the energies or another different property, and we use the machine learning to train the model. And then when we have it, we basically have the potential and the understanding of the atomic potentials. So we can take different molecular cluster, take the representation, use the model, and basically get the energy for almost free. Not this calculation was 30 hours. This is several seconds. How accurate are the machine learning methods? So you can see that here I have made like 10,000 of data. So it means 10,000 times 30 hours of calculations. That's doable. You can run it parallelly, and you get to the chemical accuracy. And here I'm comparing two different models. That's not important, but one of them is kernel-rich regression, quite simple. Then there is some neural network model. You can see that the kernel-rich regression becomes very computationally demanding. So that's why we left this kind of models and switched to neural networks. And we get easily below the machine learning, below the chemical accuracy. And this model took us actually some time to train. We use also GPU and few CPUs. Well, 8 hours, that's not that much, but it is something. And then it was only 3 minutes to predict 4,000 structures. So this is the advantage of neural network. You get it very fast. And the results seem to be quite accurate. So with almost chemical accuracy, we can get the quantum chemical data, which are of the chemical accuracy, yes. Okay, let's maybe check why we actually, there is another thing why we need machine learning. I will get back to the machine learning a bit later. How accurate are the quantum chemistry data for the particle formation, for the molecular cluster formation, when we compare it to experiments? So I take the method we typically use. And here I have some simple reaction, which is a water dimerization. And the theory, I mean, us, is compared to experiment very similar. That seems nice. By the way, this type of reaction, you can see that I get a positive, I should say, this is the positive binding Gibbs free energy. So this type of reaction is rather unfavorable. This cluster would, this dimer would fragment apart, most likely. Then I have different one where I have the negative value. So this cluster formation is favorable. And again, the theory looks quite good compared to experiment. And let's compare more. Here I have some a bit larger system. And it looks again like two similar numbers, just two numbers swapped. Well, I'm kidding. This is still the error is less than 1 kcal per mole. So I guess we are within the chemical accuracy. The same here. But you can see that the error is getting bigger when the cluster is getting larger. So what if we actually take larger molecular clusters? And there is not that many experimental studies except this one, where they study hydration of bisulfate. This is the experiment, and this is what we calculated. Well, maybe we are not that good, and we are doing the quantum chemistry wrong. So we compared our result also to some other theories, and they get something similar. They get it in very good detail, studied, but we got the result very fast. So that's why we are maybe slightly worse than them. But you can see that the errors are several kcals per mole. Is it actually anyhow important for modeling the new particle formation in the atmosphere? Well, let's pick some virtual chamber. I will use this AC/DC, what I taught at the beginning. I will put some ammonia and sulfuric acid to the virtual chamber and observe how many particles are formed. And there is like 2 particles formed in a sugar cube volume per second. But this is when I'm assuming the chemical data are correct. I mean, very certain. But if they are uncertain, so this is the particle formation, this is this 2 particles per cubic centimeter per second. And this is when the inaccuracy of the binding free energy is what we have is increasing. And you can see that in the chemical accuracy of 1 kcal, we are predicting basically the particle formation with inaccuracy of 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. That's a lot. That's basically the global modelers wouldn't accept from us. So what we are actually hoping is that the errors what we have are systematic, not chaotic, but systematic. And this is actually what seems to be quite all right. So when we compared particle formation of some sulfuric acid dimethylamine clusters to experiment from Koti Chen in some flow tube experiment where she mixed sulfuric acid and dimethylamine and observes how many particles are formed after 2 seconds of the flow. We get very similar trends, but we are like order of magnitude off. And this is what I'm talking about. We have this systematic error. And if we want in future to get also rid of the systematic error, we will need to do something better about describing the conformational ensemble in the binding free energy calculation. So for that, you cannot use the classical thermodynamic quantum chemistry as we know it, but you have to use molecular dynamic simulations. That would be computationally super demanding, but when we use this machine learning model, the trained one, we actually trained not only energies, but forces as well. And now we can basically run a molecular dynamic simulation of molecular clusters at very cheap cost and study that. We are just studying that now, so I cannot present that many results. But I hope that in future, to properly understand the dynamics, not only of clusters themselves, but the whole new particle formation, I hope that we will get to something like this, where we will have a box and basically study atmosphere and particle formation or cluster formation in the atmosphere. Okay, by this, I will just conclude what I talked about. I talked about that we are studying atmospheric new particle formation, that we have some quantum chemistry, and there is the configurational sampling and describing the potential energy surface, which is very necessary, and improving the entropy will be necessary in future. Maybe the whole take-home message from my talk, what you should remember is whatever kind of system you are studying, you should do proper configurational sampling. Or like see the full system from all the angles. By this, I would like to thank you for your attention and all the collaborators, etc. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm Camden Chen from UC Davis. So my question is, will your machine learning model in someday become reactive so that we can consider how chemical reactions affect the new particle formation?
Yeah, that's actually very good, because what is the disadvantage if, okay, I have the quantum chemistry, the Schrödinger equation. What people were often trying to do is to use molecular mechanics, some approximation of the quantum chemistry, but there you often fail with the reactivity. The proton transfers are not well described, but machine learning can actually capture this, because you do provide all the data where the whatever proton transfer occurred, where some reaction occurred, and if you provide all these data, then you of course model them well. If you do not provide them, then you will fail most likely. But in our model, so this is the sulfuric acid water, you can see that we have this proton transfer occurring, basically quite well described by the network neural model we are using. I guess it also could depend slightly on the molecular representation which you are using, but that would be a bit longer discussion.
Okay, I'm being told that's all the time we have, so let's move on to the next one. Think like Jakub. All right, so next we have Hilda Sandström. She is a postdoctoral researcher at Aalto University. She's a computational chemist who specializes in planetary and atmospheric chemistry. She received her PhD degree from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden during the spring of 2022. And is currently developing machine learning tools to assist the study of atmospheric processes with mass spectrometry.
Hey, thank you very much. I am sad not to be there in California and present this live, but very happy to have this opportunity to share our work through Zoom. Today, I work together with Professor Patrick Rinke at Aalto University, and we recently joined a center of excellence that aims to integrate machine learning methods into the study of atmospheric chemistry. And today I will talk to you about how we have been characterizing atmospheric molecules and mass spectrometry data for machine learning so far. So in particular, my talk today will focus on the topic of compound identification, which is central to atmospheric chemistry. Emissions into the atmosphere contain many different types of compounds that through photoreactions and oxidation create a whole host of different reaction products, some of which form clusters and integrate into aerosol particles, which affect the climate and also our air quality through air pollution. And to map this compound space and gain a better basic knowledge of these atmospheric chemical processes, we need compound identification. And currently in in atmospheric chemistry, mass spectrometry is one of the methods of choice to perform molecular identification. We can get information about molecular composition and through fragmentation spectra or coupled to other analytical methods, we can also gain information about functional groups, which help us make a definite molecular identification. And in our work, we would like to, integrate machine learning methods into this workflow, both to make this process fast and more accurate. So compound identification with mass spectrometry has been done for many years without data-driven methods, and the traditional approach is to do a library search, where basically the mass spectrometrist will record a mass spectrum and then query a mass spectral database that contains reference compounds which have their mass spectra recorded. The spectrum is matched to the most similar spectrum in the library, and that's how the compound is identified. And when I did a literature search to survey the success rate of this approach in atmospheric chemistry, the reported success rate is between 2 to 35%. I found 3 different studies that looked at samples of aerosols collected in field campaigns. And in all 3 studies, about 100 different compounds were identified, and the difference in percentage that you see is based on the estimated total number of compounds that they thought they had in their samples. So this is the baseline that we would like to improve upon with machine learning. So luckily for us, this challenge of identifying compounds with mass spectrometry is not unique to atmospheric chemistry. In fact, fields like metabolomics have been working on this challenge for 10 to 15 years and have made great strides. Today, most machine learning methods use a similar schematic that you can see in this slide, where a spectrum, for example, a tandem spectrum, is used as input to a machine learning model, and the model then translates this spectrum representation into a molecular representation, which we typically refer to as a molecular fingerprint. The molecular fingerprint is a high-dimensional vector of ones and zeros. And the usefulness of doing this trick with machine learning is that these fingerprints can also be obtained for all molecules in compound databases like PubChem, for example. So instead of matching the spectral representation, one would search for similarities in this molecular fingerprint representation instead. And then the highest scoring compound is identified as your compound that you are searching for then. The benefit here is that we gain access to a much larger compound space to search that can be of up to of more than 4 orders of magnitudes larger than that, which is collected in these mass spectral libraries. I forgot to say, but one of the reasons that the authors of these traditional mass spectral library searches that have looked at aerosol samples, they suspect that the reason why they were not able to identify more of their compounds in the aerosol samples is because atmospheric chemistry is just lacking reference compounds in these mass spectral libraries. So gaining access to these type of compound databases could alleviate this issue for atmospheric chemists. So this is the type of model that we would like to begin implementing into the atmospheric mass spectrometry workflow. But the initial challenge that we are facing when trying to translate these models into a new application domain is the fact that the distribution of compound classes inside the mass spectral libraries that have been used to train these models do not originate from atmospheric chemistry as we have just seen. So what exists inside these databases is mainly metabolite compounds and drug molecules. This pie chart shows the class distribution of this year's edition of the NIST Tandem Mass Spectral Library. And the previous versions used to have an even larger share of metabolites in the data distribution. So what we did in our initial survey is that we compared the molecular data sets that have been used to train these machine learning models to atmospheric molecular data sets in order to understand where our data positions itself with respect to the training data to these models. So I will share with you today our work in comparing these molecular data sets. I collected 3 different molecular data sets from atmospheric chemistry. These were all curated computationally. I refer to them as the Gecko, Wang, and Keenon dataset. The Gecko and Wang dataset were generated by the Gecko A and the master chemical mechanism algorithms, respectively. So these are codes that simulate atmospheric chemistry. And based on a different set of parent compounds, you end up, and a certain number of iterations of your algorithm, you end up with a different number of reaction products. And then my third atmospheric molecular dataset is a curated set of kenones, which are these oxidized or oxidation products of aromatics. And if we look at just the distribution of heavy atoms, which here refers to just non-hydrogen atoms, we see that these 3 datasets cover slightly different areas of the atmospheric compound space. So I want to compare these datasets with some molecular datasets that are representative to those that have been used to train the existing machine learning models for compound identification with mass spectrometry. I chose 2. The Nobla DFT dataset, which is a computationally curated dataset of over 1 million drug-like compounds. And then I also grabbed the molecules inside the mass bank of North America to make my comparison. So to do the comparison of the molecules, I need to make use of some type of molecular representation. And here I make use of a molecular fingerprint similar to that which is used as, which is the output of the machine learning models that are used in compound identification. Here there exists a variety of different representations, and I chose the one for my analysis that I will show you today, which is called the topological fingerprint. It basically tracks different paths inside a 2-dimensional molecular geometry. So for example, you see here that a path of 5 different carbon atoms have been highlighted in this structure, and this will then be hashed into this binary 1s and 0s inside the fingerprint. So on this slide, you see part of the results of my analysis. I did a T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding clustering of these datasets. This is an unsupervised machine learning method which clusters high-dimensional data and projects their similarity into 2 dimensions. And the way to interpret this figure that you see in this slide is to look for which datasets cluster together. If they cluster together, that basically means that the algorithm considers them similar in or close together in high-dimensional space. And the standout feature in this plot is that we have the mass bank of North America, which basically encircles the other datasets. It has some overlap as well with the Nobla DFT dataset, and that's expected because the mass bank also contains these drug-like molecules. And if we look at the atmospheric datasets, on the other hand, you have the Gecko and Keenon datasets, which basically form their own clusters. and the Wang dataset, which joins some of the clusters of the Gecko dataset. So from this qualitative analysis, we can say that using this fingerprint representation, we can see a separation of the different datasets with the non-atmospheric datasets tending to cluster apart or together, but not together with the atmospheric ones, which indicates that we have not really a good data overlap. So I wanted to quantify the similarity using the Tanimoto index as well, which is another way to measure molecular similarity. The Tanimoto index basically looks at these molecular fingerprints and counts the number of shared features and contrasts that with the number of features that the molecules have that are not shared. So basically you get an index that ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 indicating that these molecules don't have any shared features in their fingerprints, and 1 indicating that all of the features that they have or that are triggered by this fingerprint are shared. So I did a pairwise similarity analysis for the largest atmospheric dataset that I have, which is the Gecko dataset. And I compared that to the non-atmospheric datasets, which was the metabolite and drug-like datasets. And what you see in this figure is the distributions of the Tanimoto index. The green distribution corresponds to the similarity of the Gecko molecules with each other. So that's my reference distribution. And then the yellow and blue distributions show the similarity between the Gecko molecules and the mass bank and Nabla DFT molecules. The average similarity is higher between the Gecko molecules, but not by much. What instead stands out is that we have a larger standard deviation for the distribution of similarities within the Gecko dataset compared to these other ones. And in particular, the conclusion here is that there is not a large fraction of the mass bank or Nabla DFT that shares many of their features with the Gecko molecules.
Well, your time's about up, so if you could wrap it up, that would be great.
Yes. So coming to my final slide then, this work that I have presented here is a part of an analysis that we did for a perspective article that we just had accepted, and that is published on Archive if you're interested to read more. In the perspective, we outline an action plan for how to arrive at a better, or how to arrive at a point where we are able to actually develop these models for compound identification of atmospheric molecules. Right now, the mass spectral libraries are lacking relevant data, and we need community efforts to both share standardization practices and infrastructure to make this type of mass spectrometry data available for the machine learning developers. And I would be happy if you have any collaborators, or if you have some data that you are interested in using in this way, feel free to contact me after this. So, thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you the fingerprint, the topological fingerprint, how it must have some hyperparameters, no? Like how far, how long is the chain I want to integrate into the fingerprint? So how many hyperparameters does it have? Or could you talk about the topological fingerprint? Yeah.
Right. So typically the hyperparameters that are used for the topological fingerprint are, like you said, the length of the fingerprint, also how long these paths inside the molecules, how long they could be basically. So you specify a max path length. And then you can also specify the number of bits that your path should be encoded into. Those are typically the three that are used. But for this analysis, I used the default parameters in the RDKit package that I used.
So we have two more presentations. The next one is Kostas Tsigaridis, I'm guessing. Close. Tsigaridis. He's a research scientist at Columbia University and NASA GISS. His research interests aim in understanding the role that aerosols play in the Earth system by studying the interactions and feedbacks between the atmosphere, the terrestrial biosphere, the ocean, and the climate. He has contributed to a number of different IPCC reports and is currently working on developing the next generation of the GISS model ESM, the GISS model E3, which will be part of CMIP 7.
So this is going to be the biggest leap you've ever done in a conference, probably going from molecular level into millennia timescales. So this is work that my intern has done. Where is the... So Malcolm has done most of the work here, other than the actual simulations themselves. He's an intern looking for his next internship. He's super good. If you want for an intern, you can reach out to me. So I'll be talking about simulations with a GISS system model. And just to motivate what I'm doing here is that we have the data sets like these that span like 2.5 millennia in the x-axis that show the tree growth anomaly, which is used as a climate metric, and also temperature. And what we can see is that we can link cool periods of time that you see with circles in the top panel here with the volcanic eruptions that we detect in ice cores, both in Greenland and Antarctica. And we can, of course, causation is not correlation, but mostly we know that the volcanic eruptions do cool the Earth's atmosphere, especially if they are big ones. And the interesting thing is that you can see some of the major eruptions here with the longer lines. The main thing is that we don't know necessarily where these eruptions have happened. So we see them in the data records. Let's say, take this 2057, for example, like 800 years ago. You can see that it's there, but we don't know where it happened. So we only know things like Northern Hemisphere eruption because we only detect it in Greenland, or Southern Hemisphere because we only detect it in Antarctica, or tropical because we detect it in both. But that's not necessarily enough. And if I zoom into 2 periods of time only, so at the top you see from 100 years BCE to 200, and then at the bottom you see the pre-industrial to present day. There are a lot of eruptions that are interesting. So obviously you can all know of Pinatubo, and then there is another type like a Pinatubo-like. It's very similar. The y-axis is slightly different, but this eruption here is very similar with Pinatubo. And we have published about this 4 eruptions that happened within a decade, and the climate impacts. You can see the reference right there. But the important thing is that we don't know where they are. So if we want to simulate those, we just improvise. You know, we place some eruptions in some historical volcanoes, and then we see what happens. But that's not enough if you want to really do some proper analysis. So what we did is that we said, okay, let's do a Latin hypercube sampling of the uncertain parameter space that we have, which includes longitude, latitude, the day of the eruption, the location of the eruption in the vertical, both including the bottom and the top of the plume, and also the injected amount in terms of SO2 and water. And we create a parameter space that we believe is realistic, like anywhere in the world and any time during the year, and some range that goes from like 2 kilometers over the crater of the volcano up to 40 kilometers for the plume bottom and plus a 10, like throughout the stratosphere in practice. And then SO2 amounts from practically nothing to 100, and the water amounts from practically nothing to 500. And I have as a reference here Pinatubo. And I want to mention this part here, that the plume top is correlated with the plume bottom and the plume thickness. And I need you to remember that for next slides. So just to see what happens in bulk, these are all the 140 simulations we have done. And you see the anomaly essentially of the sulfate burden compared to a control simulation that had no eruption. And I'm using the anomaly because there is also background simulation. We use pre-industrial climate, but there are still SO2 emissions going on because, you know, we have effusive eruptions, you have still a minimal, but some anthropogenic component there. You have biomass burning that also injects SO2. So we take all that out and by subtracting the control from our experiments. And what you can see here is that there is variability. This is the months after the eruption. And so essentially after 4 or 5 years, everything is gone. But what you can see here is that there are some dark lines here, which show that, which are the injections that happen inside the troposphere that practically go away very quickly. And then all the bright colors that are the injections that happen high in the stratosphere survive for much longer. There is also an interesting feature that there are some eruptions that show this flattening at the beginning that shows that the eruptions happen in a place where it's kind of dark, maybe near the pole that is winter, and then the chemistry kicks in much later. So I'm not going to discuss about this, but I just wanted to highlight it. And then essentially you see a separation here between the different altitudes of the injection. And if you see it differently, and this is the cumulative deposition of sulfate in the atmosphere, outside the atmosphere, you see that very much more clearly that everything deposits super quickly when you are in the lower, when the injection happens in the lowest part of the atmosphere. So inside the troposphere where removal is quick. And then it happens much slower and when you go higher up in the stratosphere, again, a lifetime thing. And this bifurcation happens abruptly in the tropopause. So it doesn't matter whether you inject something really at the 5 or 8 kilometers or at 25 or 35 kilometers, but it does matter whether you are below or above the tropopause because of cloud removal. We can see these things in different ways. So this is the fractional SO2 deposited sulfur compared to total. And you see that when you are at the plume bottom is low, there is a lot of SO2 being deposited. When the plume bottom is much higher, there is a lot of SO2, very little SO2 is being deposited, everything is converted into sulfate. And then you see that the black dots here that deviate from where you want your asymptote to be are the ones that have very low amount of sulfur injected, which just shows that there is some noise there because, you know, this is an Earth system model. You have a volcano that goes off, even if it is just nothing, the butterfly effect will change the dynamics in the transporter in the atmosphere so that it will create some noise that will be affecting some of those results. And since it's a climate model, I have to show a climate plot. This shows how the global mean surface temperature cools after each eruption. And this funny thing here, just in case you noticed, is only because we are shifting the plot in the x-axis so that all eruptions that happened throughout the year start at the same point on the x-axis. So this is just the background before any eruption happened, depending on, and it shows you how far off you are into the year when the eruption happens. So don't pay attention to it. What you see here is that there is a big cooling, that some of the largest eruptions have larger cooling. And again, you see, and here you see that the bright colors are a lot of SO2 and the dark colors are very little SO2. So you again see what it was expected. So we said, okay, we have a 7-dimensional parameter space, and these are 8 components here because I'm also including plume top here, which is a derivative of plume bottom plus plume thickness. And we correlate essentially the parameter we study against the integrated sulfur deposition. And we see that there is some correlation in the latitude. So the brighter colors, meaning a lot of SO2 injected, are happening, you can separate the latitude dimension here, the amount with the latitude. And then it's also more clear here when you say the more SO2 you have, all the green points align on the one side and the blue points on the other side, which shows some correlations like that. And then weaker correlations are the plume bottom, because essentially what it matters, as I told you, is the amount in the stratosphere versus the amount in the troposphere. It's okay to have a little bit of the plume in the troposphere, but if you have a significant amount in the stratosphere, that's what will drive the response. And then there are some other things like the actual day of the year doesn't matter too much, or the plume thickness, because it is controlled mostly about the plume edges rather than the thickness itself, and also the longitude. Remember that the ice cores are having a resolution like several months at best. It goes even to a couple of years if you are having older ice cores. So we cannot really resolve any seasonality here. So what we did is that we took the eruption parameters, and instead of an Earth system model, we used a machine learning model that was trained on this data set, and created a whole system that includes thousands of cases to calculate a polar sulfate deposition. And the idea is that we want to move that backwards, because the goal is to take the deposition data that we have, because this is what the ice scores are giving us, and go into the eruption parameters. Ideally find the location, but finding any of the other things is also welcome. And so this is what we've done with the Markov chain Monte Carlo or MCMC parameter estimation, and which looks like this. So if you take the different parameters and you create probability density functions from the simulations that the machine learning is creating, you make plots like these that sometimes they look flat, sometimes they look very nice, and sometimes they are the model, the vertical line is the reality for this one case that we're studying, because you remember we're still in the model world, so we know which volcano created this distribution here. So sometimes we can get that not exactly perfectly, but this is a Julian day, so there is a lot of uncertainty in the seasonality there that we cannot capture simply from the data. But then the plume bottom, sorry, this is latitude. And then the plume bottom here is captured pretty well, because it is a very clear signal, stratosphere versus troposphere. And in any case, what we get if we combine those things is that we can get a map like that, and we say, okay, the main goal was to find out where the volcano is for a certain case, right? So clearly it is somewhere here. So we're looking in this particular case a tropical volcano, and but then if we cherry pick from all this cloud of data that are captured into those two different PDFs, the cases where we have the deposition matching the one that we expect to have, we see that we can get the likelihood increases for certain locations, like right there. And if we see the reality is this red point here. So all those yellow points, and there is also one more here, are pretty successful in predicting where the actual volcano is. And then we can also see into the more dimensions of this problem. So to conclude, we've done all this, and we get some pretty good results, and we're going to go into the future into simulating, into actually using actual ice core data and trying to locate volcanoes that we know happened, like Tambora or Pinatubo, and further improve that and go further into a climate response probably. And I'll stop here to take any questions. Thanks a lot.
Mr. Kostas? Great talk, Kostas. This is super cool. Investigative work. So you brought up the importance of tropopause height a bunch, and it made me wonder why you had absolute height of injection rather than a normalized height, like where you took the ratio of plume bottom and plume top to the tropopause height as an input, would that, do you think that would help things? Because at least between tropical injections and extratropical conduction.
So
injections.
the answer to your question is because we were not expecting to see that when we were designing experiment. So after having seen that, in retrospect, that's actually a very good result, because in future design of refining these experiments, we don't have to worry about the amounts exactly in the troposphere or the stratosphere, or in the troposphere or the stratosphere. We can simply say, forget about tropopause. It's not going to show up unless there is a volcano right next to the ice core. And then we focus on the stratosphere, which simplifies the problem.
Gotcha. Thanks. I was wondering how the QBO affects your emulator, because it kind of throws a random north-south change in where it's distributed, but you didn't really talk about it, and it didn't seem to show up in your PDF in the end.
So we don't have a spontaneously resolved QBO in this version of the model. We have it in a higher model top that we have not used for our technical reasons. And we will have it in the next generation of the model that we're developing right now, and we might repeat that. But for now, we have mostly Easterlies in the model.
Nice talk, Kostas. A very basic question, which is volcanoes shouldn't be randomly distributed by latitude, right? So that essentially provides another additional constraint in knowing their location.
Yes, so they are randomly distributed in our case with latitude. We essentially randomly distribute them based on the cosine of the latitude, so that we will take into account that the zones become thinner as you go towards the poles. But yeah, the distribution is totally random in there based on the Latin hypercube sampling, which is essentially, if you have rooks on the chessboard, they should not attack with threaten each other at all. That's the randomness. And we on purpose ignored the locations where we had the ocean, because we don't know if there is any underwater volcano that went off, and we just didn't want to bother about that.
So this is David Topping. He's a professor of the digital environment, working for many years modeling the evolution of aerosol composition. He's an atmospheric scientist by trade. He's also spent many years working on smart city, environment, Internet of Things projects. Now spends most of the working time at the AI environment interface. So I'll welcome David.
Thanks everyone. I often find myself as the barrier between lunch, but I think you seem more forgiving than 150 18-year-olds in my calculus class, so I'll whiz through this. Okay, so it's great to be here. I guess I'm here with a few hats on. As Chris says, I'm a tortured coder academic. I'd like to work on aerosol model developments, but I've spent a number of the last few years working at the interface in understanding what happens when end users want to use the data we're generating and the tools we build. And that then comes back to us rethinking how sustainable are our tools? Are we developing it in a sustainable way? So with this rather ambitious title, what I'd like to talk about really is think for a short period about data-driven aerosol science. We've heard some fantastic talks this morning. That's definitely the direction of travel. I think what we're seeing in every domain at the moment is a useful refocus on the underlying infrastructure and what we need to reinvest in to make this a sustainable path for our scientific end goals. So I'll then refer to a program that we're leading for the UK's Natural Environment Research Council called the Digital Solutions Hub. And that's a facility to connect the UK's entire environmental data holdings with health, finance, socioeconomic data, and then think about where that leaves us. I think very much preaching to the converted. I mean, obviously, we've always used data in scientific research, but I think what data science is doing, and certainly has done for the last 5 years and maybe more, is placing more of an emphasis on parts of the life cycle that were otherwise often ignored. So for example, once we collect some data, we have to clean it, process it, do some EDA on that. And whilst a lot of the public narrative focuses on the models and the algorithms, we're seeing much more investment and time spent thinking around things like ethics, standards, sustainability, and training. There's obviously a long way to go, but it's good that these have a raised profile now. I think from an aerosol perspective, as we've seen this morning, we've reached certain barriers, I think, in terms of how we build aerosol models using traditional methodologies. Things like machine learning offer a route around some of those couplings that we're interested in and the ability to ingest data that otherwise would be quite hard to do so. And from my perspective as well, it's now really changing how we engage with end users of our research. And there are certainly obvious links to be made throughout this talk, for example, on the back end of a regional air quality model, for example. I've always been quite interested in that landscape of, fundamental data we build our understanding around, how we turn that into model architectures, how we get people to use the models, and then how we get people to use the outcome of those models. I don't mind saying, I think how we've worked up to a certain point was always quite linear. If you look at this diagram here, I always felt that there were more model users than more model developers. I think what data science is doing now is changing the flow of information between those stakeholders in this landscape. So you'd imagine a linear process in the past that might have gone clockwise around that circle, but we're now seeing examples of just going straight from bottom to right, okay, using data science frameworks. And that's a good and a bad thing. I'm not going to comment on that largely here. I think part of this is being driven by what we're exposed to and what we learn how to use in academic research. And I think the infiltration of emerging data science technologies is increasing with speed. I mean, I fondly remember it was around about Python 2.6, suddenly realizing, yes, I can build a numerical aerosol model and I can connect that with informatics and then start looking at the impacts of molecular properties, so on and so forth on the model framework. But what we're seeing now, of course, is bleeding edge technologies entering into academic research quite quickly. So every year, there's something called the Gartner Hype Cycle that's produced. And it's really interesting to look at. And this is a conglomerate that get together to try and understand from the point of an innovation trigger, so an idea, how quickly that technology enters widespread use. So you have a period where a small number of people develop the idea further. We suddenly think it can solve everything. It reaches the peak of expectations. And then the more people can access and use it, we suddenly realize it can't solve everything. But then even more people use it and we reach this plateau of productivity. And the interesting from the last few years is there's always been a machine learning component at the peak of inflated expectations. And of course, we're all aware at the moment that generative AI is at the forefront of everything we talk about with regards to AI futures, ChatGPT being an obvious example of that. I think it's exciting because if you see here, the expectation is generative AI is only 2 to 5 years away from widespread adoption. And I think we're seeing that already. We talked about the landscape that we used to previously and the connections between those parts of the landscape, model developers and model users, but we're also seeing much more of a broader interest from the technology sector now. And I don't think we're necessarily separate from that, certainly in the area of air quality modeling. We'll have already seen the really rapid advances that are being had now, weather prediction and nowcasting by Google and DeepMind and the likes. It's only a matter of time, really, before we see widespread adoption of air quality forecasting as well. We had a presentation from IBM locally 2 weeks ago, who were talking about their foundation model development. So a foundation model, very large model that learns from huge amounts of unlabeled data and can abstract relationships to then make generalized predictions. We're now seeing foundational geospatial models for hazard forecasting. And then it becomes interesting, right? I mean, what's the role in academia here? Where do we sit in the development of these technologies? Which we'll get towards at the end. But generally, it's exciting. And it's not just affecting the technologies we can use to implement our scientific research, but also how we create those models, right? I mean, I now regularly show students in my undergraduate class how to use ChatGPT for code generation. And it's fun, right? You can then translate between different code platforms. It's here to stay. I mean, the workflow of how we can generate models now is definitely changed. And I think I don't need to labor on this point. We've seen, again, some great examples this morning. We're seeing some really fascinating data-driven developments in aerosol science. I always like to use the one on the left-hand side, an example we were kind of involved with, a company called SwissEns that built a holographic instrument that can turn those holographic images into distinct pollen types. And then we helped to generate the first real-time data stream. That was a nice end-to-end example of going from a new technology to an actual usable outcome. We've all seen this diagram before. We know that to get to exascale, machine learning integration in large-scale models, as we've already seen, is part of the solution, not just from a complexity perspective, but also from an energy footprint perspective. Okay. But I also said that I think data science is changing how we develop aerosol models, how we bring in multimodal data sets. And this was a project that we were involved with to look at personal exposure to PM 2.5. What this graph on the left-hand side shows is squiggly diagrams. This is a map of Greater Manchester, and these are hypothetical scenarios of where people go during any given day, to and from work and then back to home. The Turing Institute, during the COVID response, developed an agent-based model to predict where people spent their time. Of course, you can imagine the use of that for predicting the COVID response. That's built on a series of mobility data sets, such as time travel surveys, mobile phone data, so on and so forth. And the outcomes give us population distributions, hourly person exposures, and uncertainties in those. And you now have a framework that you can actually sit underneath or on top of maps of PM 2.5 or measurements in different microenvironments. And this was a good example of how quickly we can go from an idea through to a pretty impactful diagram that has a series of political connotations. One of the interesting components of that is this synthetic population that the model creates. So what you have in this diagram is age group and then weekday or weekend, broken down by the time spent in different microenvironments. And of course, what we're hearing now in terms of air quality research is we know we spend the majority of our time indoors. And this synthetic population data set shows where we spend our time, whether it's in the office, whether it's on transport, whether it's outdoors. So once you sit that data set, and I would say this is currently written in R, the model is open source. Over the next year, we're going to convert it to Python with proper documentation. So if anyone's interested in using this model for your own geospatial or geographical remit, please let us know, get in touch. But of course, once you then start looking at that mapping, combining that information with model predictions of PM 2.5, you get quite impactful diagrams. And of course, they have various political connotations here, right? So when we showed this as a demonstrator of what's possible to the local authorities, they were very, very concerned that we were saying, well, you know, if you're on a train, then your personal exposure is going to be dominated by that half hour on that transport system. I think generally what it shows us is we can get to somewhere very quickly, but then it opens up the real importance of the provenance in the data on which these kind of systems were built. Okay, and obviously these bars could go up, these predicted exposure levels can go up and down by different microenvironments as the data in those environments become better known. So this then aligns with what we're trying to do on a national scale in terms of improving data access and provenance. It's a little bit tangential to what we're thinking about, I guess, in this meeting, but I think some of the outcomes are still worthwhile reflecting on in terms of model development. So the Digital Solutions Hub is a 5-year funded program, and the idea is to try and connect, as I said at the beginning, the UK's environmental data with non-academic end users, so potential end users of the science and the data that we generate. This is just to give you an idea of the landscape in the UK on environmental data. There are 5 different data centres. They serve different communities in a fairly siloed way. But the key is we wanted to make that data more available. more accessible. But to do that, we have to understand what people need in terms of the data that we can provide. And that's both measurement and model data. One of the obvious use cases is combining environment and health data. And I wanted to put this up actually, because in terms of the infrastructure and how what we need to be aware of in the science that we do, and I can appreciating the session after this. Obviously, there's a lot of really important work that's been done in combining air quality and population statistics over a number of decades now. But expectations over sensitive data requirements are changing. When we put this program together, we always said that we would go and ask what people needed from this facility. We had a lot of interest from population health officials, not really from clinical practice. It was deemed too far removed from clinical practice. In 2 years, that's already changed. Okay, so we now have national health organizations who want to start better accessing measurement and model data products so they can understand health outcomes. But clinical and health data cannot move from where it's sat. It typically sits in a trusted research environment. And this is a federated landscape in the UK, so data has to go the other way. You have to send your environmental and model data into a TRE. So at the moment, we're developing a way to do that. There's something called UPRNs in the UK. So you imagine that in even if you have a geospatial output, a block of flats would have the same postcode, but every flat door would have a UPRN. So we're creating this layer so health officials can then pull in via UPRN the data to their system. If anyone's interested in that, there's a GitHub page so you can see what the specifications of a TRE mean, because we are aware that TREs might be required for environmental data soon. For example, indoor air quality, you can infer people are at home, what they're doing. Okay, so we're already aware that that might be available. We decided we wouldn't build something until we asked people what they wanted. So we're taking a user needs mapping approach all the way from context scoping through to user acceptance testing with agile software development practices in the middle. We ended up speaking to 84 organizations included in the Environment Agency, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the health sector, local councils. No private sector organization wanted to speak to us, but therefore we're following up with them through interviews. The key thing really we got from that was understanding the archetypes in these organizations. If anyone's interested in that research, there's an 85-page PDF, which you can look at from a bit of bedtime reading. But we started to map people in the organizations in the roles that they had. And the interesting thing here, so these were the general roles that people had. Some people just wanted to tell a story with data, but we did have modeling specialists and people like data stewards who were worried about the data quality and data sharing. Okay. The take-homes really, in understanding the landscape of these users that they operate in, the general perception, so these are non-academic end users of the data we generate. The general feeling is there's too many places where there's potential data. Okay, and it's not always obvious what the purpose of these repositories are. It's hard to keep up with the sheer range of things, and things like arduous registration processes are too difficult. There's too much of a high throughput with staffing in these organizations. The point of all of this is we can map a software architecture to try and facilitate some of these requirements. Interesting one here is that we were told quite quickly from the very start, we can't run a model unless it's in the cloud. We're not going to invest in on-premise HPC. Okay, so then developing cloud-enabled technologies for our regional model is something that's going to be of use to these organizations. In terms of key requirements, simple things. These organizations wanted to review a sample of the data set. They don't want to download huge number of NetCDF files. They want to actually look at general, simple statistics on a map. Okay, they want to avoid duplication of effort. A staff member leaves after 2 years. They want to have their replacement come in and pick up where they left off. All of these have solutions to them. Okay. Flying through these. I think really where this journey has left us is thinking about what we can do as researchers and what infrastructure we need to enable some of this effective change. I think we've reached the point where just having open data and open software is no longer enough. Certainly the case when you start speaking at this end user interface. I'm not criticizing at all the open science movement. it's great, but I think now what we're realizing when you go beyond your own little domain is just because it's open doesn't mean it's usable. So then how do we enable usability of the tools that we develop? There's massive cultural challenges here. We've got huge amounts of pushback in raising some of these questions. Because we've worked a certain way for the past 20 years, why would we change it? So we've got to make a decision really around whether we want to enable this future where data is more accessible and we can better facilitate data-driven modeling. As an example, in one of the data centers, there was 188 definitions of net CDF. That is not a good place to start when you're trying to standardize data-driven model development. Going back to the role of technology vendors and the relationship with academia, I think we're at a critical time now to try and, for us to think where we want this to go. Foundational models are being developed, They might provide a path of least resistance to a lot of these larger organizations. I think we're at the stage that Earth system models were at maybe 15 years ago in terms of digital twins and foundational models. Okay. And I think we can turn this into, this is my last slide, we can turn this into a positive story, I think. Because what we can do is to get this right, and as soon as you mention standards and regulation, you get various levels of eye rolling, but actually turning that into a story to enable innovation is key. To give you an example here, what we're doing in the Solutions Hub is, you know, if you expect people to find a data set, why can't they type a question to a search engine? For example, where will the hottest place in the UK be in 2030? By just getting the metadata right, we've enabled an LLM to actually pull out the data sets from that data center. And of course, the next step would then be to then answer that question. Okay, so it's going in the right direction. But it did make me wonder about whether or not it'd be worthwhile us reflecting on our own experience and work out what do we want to enable this data-driven future. And I think there's a huge role for IAMA there. But I've gone 2 minutes over time, so I'll stop.
Hi, Havel Pi EPA. I was curious, when you do these end user requirements exercises, are those being led by scientists, or is there, who leads those and where do the resources come from? Yeah, so as part of the team, we've actually funded a team of user requirement and business analysts who run these workshops. We actually outsource this to an organization that specialize in digital requirements. So we were very keen to not have academics sat in the workshops. We could sit in the back, but driven by understanding that it requires a professional approach, for sure. But we're happy to share the approach that we took, so you could repeat that in similar workshops.
Great talk, Dave. Thanks for your perspective on the whole big picture of data and everything. My question is going to be focused on that like exposure science part, though.
Yeah.
I guess sort of two parts. First, like when you showed the exposure concentrations in the different spots, you had it dominated by transport. Was that making the assumption that the exposure there is equal to the outdoor concentration, or was there some conversion?
Well, it was. I think it was difficult because the data we had at the time. Sorry, I'm skipping through all of these. There was a limited number of studies on indoor levels in trains in the north of England, which are all diesel stock. So you get huge amounts of PM 2.5 in there, but very limited studies.
Yeah.
Which was the point, you know. I mean, you could misinterpret that diagram quite quickly.
Yeah, there you go.
In a political way, because if we're telling people to get off the roads and then they see this and go, okay, actually, but why would I?
And what happens when you weight that by time?
That's already done that by time.
Oh, it's already, okay. So it's like a daily.
They were ridiculous concentrations.
Okay.
I had one other one, I guess. So it seems like a lot of this work is funded by the Alan Turing Institute and the UK government, right?
So the Digital Solutions is the Natural Environment Research Council. The personal exposure model and some of the tools that are connected to that are being funded by the Turing, yes.
I was wondering, can you talk about like your experience with getting funding for these types of things? Because it seems like a lot of time funders are interested in kind of something that's like a standalone, like this is the thing that we funded and it's kind of broader, like.
Yeah. Try not to be too negative. I think we're still in the situation that we experience. It's very much too much responsive rather than strategic setting in this space at the moment. What we're discussing at NERC is changing the peer review and panel process, because there's still commenting on jargon and other things when you try to get anything funded around data-driven and machine learning. But actually what you're seeing are blueprints and architectures that are, you know, are model relevant. So there's some way to go. My feeling is that there's a general consensus that, you know, we need to improve how we strategize that. And there's a role for universities as well as research councils as well. I mean, so my other hat is as a pathway lead for a master's course in data science. And some of the skills these incoming kids have are unbelievable. Like, you know, combining the domain understanding of science and being able to whip up a, you know, a Bayesian convolutional neural network and run it. I mean, crazy. So I think it's interesting where the tension's going to be, really.
Other questions? Maybe ready for lunch. All right, thank you, David.